It was one of those sticky, warm evenings that seemed to stretch indefinitely. The kind of night where the air felt thick with memories. This old restaurant, dimly lit with a hint of spice and bourbon lingering in the atmosphere, hosted our alumni reunion. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air, conjuring memories from years gone by. Initially, the conversation consisted of small talk and polite chuckles, typical filler you expect at these gatherings. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted her, Maya, and she wasn't by herself. At first, I tried to dismiss it, but then I noticed him, Derek, a figure from her past, her so-called high school sweetheart. I had heard the stories before, never paying them much mind, assuming they were just harmless reminiscences from high school. But that night felt different. He was taller, broader, and wore that annoyingly self-assured grin. He was fully aware of his good looks and clearly thought he could still win her over. I could see the spark in Maya's eyes the moment she laid eyes on him. She looked younger, almost giddy, and that expression had been absent for far too long, especially in my presence. They began to chat, completely absorbed in one another, oblivious to the crowd surrounding them. I watched, caught in a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and a gut-wrenching feeling that I desperately tried to push away. They laughed together, reminiscing as if the years that had come between them simply vanished. And good grief, Derek was laying it on thick. I caught snippets of his flattery rising above the din. "You haven't aged a day," he said, and I still remember those wild weekends, as if they were in the middle of a romantic comedy reunion. In that moment, I felt the ground beneath me begin to shift. She had that unmistakable look, the one I used to see when we first started dating, back when we couldn't keep our hands off one another. It hit me like a punch to the gut, and I realized this night was destined to alter everything. After an hour or so, I approached them, trying to keep my cool, but Maya didn't even glance my way when I greeted her. She hardly acknowledged my presence, far too engrossed in Derek to notice me. I attempted to laugh it off, but Derek wore this smug expression as if he was fully aware of the effect he was having. Eventually, I walked away, feeling like a stranger in my own life. And that was merely the beginning. Following that reunion, things took a strange turn. Maya began dressing differently, putting in an effort she hadn't shown in years. She'd always been attractive, don't get me wrong, but it was as if she was getting ready for a performance every time she stepped outside. New outfits, a fresh haircut, meticulously done nails. Heck, she even started wearing perfume again. Something felt off, but whenever I raised my concerns, she would dismiss them with laughter, as if I were imagining things. The most peculiar part? Maya's friend, Sophie, was involved too. Sophie had always been a close confidant, someone we trusted, but now she appeared almost excited about Maya's new energy. She even joked about it with me, calling it Maya's second wind, or some nonsense like that. I wanted to convince myself it was innocent, yet that uneasy feeling churned in my gut, warning me to remain vigilant. One night, I caught her texting someone late, the light from her phone illuminating her face beneath the covers. I asked casually, "Who's texting you at this hour?" "Oh, it's just Sophie," she replied, her tone a bit too laid back. "She's dealing with some family drama. You know how she gets." I forced a nod, but doubt clawed at me. Then she began going out more often, with little excuses about meeting friends or needing me time. Each time, I would ask her, "You meeting up with anyone?" She'd wave her hand dismissively, smiling a little too sweetly. "Just some girlfriends. Don't worry, I'm not that interesting," she'd say. But each time she spoke, it felt like another weight pressing down on my chest. One evening, Sophie came over for a chat, and the atmosphere felt charged with tension. She wore this expression that mingled pity and concern as she asked, "Hey, have you noticed anything different with Maya?" I paused for a moment but finally admitted, "Yeah, something seems off." Sophie nodded, biting her lip. "Just keep an eye on things, okay? If you need anything, just let me know." Those words hung in the air, unspoken accusations swirling between us. It was evident to both of us that something was unfolding, something that would upend everything I thought I knew about Maya. That night marked a turning point, the kind that feels like a flashing red flag in your mind. I started observing everything, noting the little changes she probably thought I'd overlook. Strange numbers began to appear on our phone bill, late-night calls she'd brush off as just catching up with Sophie, even though her tone was far too low, too secretive for a friendly chat. Each passing night felt like I was on the verge of cracking, like a bomb set to detonate without knowing where the fuse began. The suspicion gnawed at me, eroding the image of our relationship like rust on metal. The worst part? I could see her distancing herself more and more, diverting her attention from our family, our life, to something or someone else. But I refused to stand by and watch her dismantle our marriage piece by piece without putting up a fight. It began subtly, just minor changes here and there. At first, I thought maybe she was simply going through a phase, perhaps grappling with something personal she hadn't shared. But I could sense her slipping away, withdrawing, as if a wall was being erected one brick at a time. Maya spent more time on her phone, always finding an excuse to be out in the evenings, claiming it was a girls' night or something she needed for herself. She'd deliver these lines with that same sweet smile that used to melt my heart, but now it felt like a thin veil hiding something much darker. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, but with every outing she took, that chill in my gut intensified, whispering that something was undeniably wrong. One evening, I heard her phone ring, and she glanced my way before slipping out onto the balcony, barely bothering to close the door behind her. The air felt thick, and I found myself straining to catch any snippet of her conversation. I managed to hear a few words drift through the open door. I caught her saying, "Yes, I miss you," her voice softer and more intimate than usual, followed by, "We can meet." That was all I needed to hear. Just those few phrases, but they struck me like a lightning bolt. A surge of jealousy shot through me, hot and relentless. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself it wasn't what it seemed. But the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, no matter how desperately I wished they wouldn't. When she returned from the call, she glanced at me, her face carefully composed. She flashed that fake sweet smile she'd been using more frequently lately. "Just Sophie," she said. "She's having a tough time, and I didn't want to bother you with it." I didn't press the issue, but deep down I knew she was lying. Every word dripped with deceit, and I felt lost, torn between whether confronting her would make things worse or if I should play it cool, hoping she might come clean on her own. Yet, each time I attempted to make eye contact, to coax some genuine emotion from her, she retreated further behind that practiced smile. A couple of days later, I went out with a few friends from work. We gathered at a dimly lit bar that smelled faintly of old wood and spilled beer, a place where we used to laugh about trivial matters after a long day. But that night, I struggled to keep up with the lighthearted banter. It must have been obvious because eventually, my old friend Colin asked me directly, "All right, man, what's going on? You've seemed off all night." I tried to brush it off initially, but I reached a point where holding it in just didn't make sense anymore. "It's Maya," I began, glancing around as if expecting her to materialize from the shadows. I don't know, man. She's different, distant, always on her phone, going out in the evenings, brushing off everything I ask." Colin's expression shifted to a mix of concern and curiosity. "You think there's someone else?" His words hit me hard, as if he'd put a voice to the fears I'd been trying to ignore. "I don't know," I admitted, and it sounded weak, even to my own ears. Deep down, I felt there was something more. Colin didn't push, but leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I hope I'm wrong, but if you think something's going on, don't just ignore it. Keep your eyes open, stay alert. I can help if it comes to that." His offer lingered in the air, and while it felt odd to consider that level of caution, I recognized he was right. If I wanted the truth, I couldn't just wait for her to come clean. The following weekend, I tried to set everything aside and suggested we go out for dinner. I wanted it to be an evening just for us, a chance to reconnect or at least gain some insight into what was happening between us. She agreed, but once we arrived at the restaurant, it was evident her mind was elsewhere. I noticed her checking her phone every few minutes, glancing around as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. I attempted to engage her in small talk, asking about her day and her weekend plans. But she responded with short, distracted answers, her eyes darting back to her phone. My patience was wearing thin, and it took everything in me not to call her out right there in front of everyone. When she excused herself to go to the restroom, I picked up her phone from the table, hoping to uncover something that would explain this chaotic situation. Naturally, it was locked. She changed the code. I quickly put it back down just as she returned, flashing me that same empty smile. I could feel myself starting to detach, a numbness settling in as if it were easier to distance myself than confront the harsh reality. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. A few days later, curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself snooping. I wasn't proud of it, but I felt I needed answers. While she was out, I rummaged through her laptop and discovered a hidden social media profile, an account under a name I'd never seen her use. There were messages, threads of conversations that extended late into the night. She was talking to Derek. That confirmed everything. She had been hiding this entire relationship behind a fake identity, keeping me blissfully unaware. I had barely scratched the surface, yet I could glimpse their exchanges, fragments of a world built on secrets and lies. They weren't even being careful about it. It was as if they believed I'd never think to look, that I'd never suspect my own wife could betray me in such a way. I felt like an absolute fool, reading the words they shared, witnessing how she laughed with him, how she spoke to him with a warmth I hadn't felt in ages. There were moments I wanted to smash the laptop, to confront her with every single word they'd exchanged, but something restrained me. Perhaps it was the need to formulate a plan, or maybe I simply wanted to know how deep her deception ran before I laid all my cards on the table. At this point, there was no denying the truth. I'd been watching my marriage unravel in slow motion, but this was a slap in the face, undeniable proof that she had discarded everything we'd built together, everything I had believed in. The worst part? I could see it in her every day, yet she was too absorbed in her little affair to notice that I was catching on. So I waited, I observed, and every time she snuck away for a girls' night or slipped onto the balcony for one of those hushed phone calls, I could feel my patience wearing thin. I arranged to meet Sophie at a cozy cafe, a quiet spot tucked away from the bustling main street. It felt odd reaching out to her just to discuss Maya, but I needed someone who understood my turmoil. She had been close to both of us for years, and it felt surreal knowing she was the one person I could trust to be brutally honest. As soon as she sat down, I noticed the mix of pity and disgust reflected in her eyes. She had always been more loyal to me than Maya, and that loyalty was evident. As we spoke, I laid everything bare. Every lie, every late-night girls' night I had caught her sneaking off for, every secretive glance exchanged with her phone. Sophie listened intently, her expression tightening with each revelation. She didn't hold back, openly condemning Maya for being such a selfish coward. Hearing someone else acknowledge Maya's behavior felt like a balm for my wounded pride. The tension between us hung thick in the air, a charged silence I had never experienced with her before. I didn't see it coming, but in that moment, anger and betrayal intertwined with something new. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and firm. I couldn't recall the last time someone looked at me with such genuine concern. It felt strange, even wrong, but there was something undeniably real in her gaze. It felt like a challenge, a temptation, a way to reclaim something I thought I had lost. We both understood the gravity of the moment, and that night, one thing led to another and we ended up in bed together. I can't even articulate the satisfaction it brought. Not just from the act itself, but because it felt like a reclaiming of my agency, a reminder that I wasn't the fool she assumed I was. After that night, everything shifted. Sophie and I became allies, united by a common purpose, each feeding off the other's energy. She was just as eager as I was to see Maya's downfall, and she wasn't afraid to do whatever it took to help me achieve it. Together, we started piecing things together, plotting how to expose Maya's lies and ensure she understood exactly what she was losing. We began meeting more frequently, sometimes in public, sometimes at my place, discussing strategies and brainstorming ways to catch her in a lie she couldn't deny. It was Sophie who suggested we dig deeper into Derek's life. She proposed we uncover any details that could reveal who he really was. If Maya had chosen him over me, maybe his past could illuminate her path back to reality. That's when we discovered Gavin, an old acquaintance of Derek's who had worked with him years prior. Sophie had a connection through a mutual friend, and before long, I found myself sitting in a dingy bar with Gavin, absorbing stories that made my blood boil. He was all too willing to spill every dark detail. It turned out Derek had a history, tales of manipulation, leading women on, and using them to achieve his goals. Gavin laughed bitterly as he recounted these stories, clearly resentful about how things had ended between them. The more I listened, the more I realized this situation wasn't just about me anymore. Derek wasn't some charming old flame to Maya. He was a user, plain and simple, and she had fallen right into his trap. Gavin shared Derek's old habits, his tricks for getting what he wanted from people. He even bragged about how easy it was to manipulate women into doing things for him, buying him things and covering his expenses. I could feel the anger simmering beneath my skin, a rage I had never experienced before. Sophie played her role flawlessly. She began spending more time at my place, lingering whenever Maya might be on her way home. The goal wasn't to make anything obvious. It was simply to leave subtle hints. She would drape her scarf over a chair or leave her lipstick on the bathroom counter. It was all understated, but enough for Maya to start noticing. And it worked. I could see it in the way Maya started looking at me, a flicker of doubt she tried to conceal, a hint of jealousy she wasn't prepared to admit. I wanted her to feel that same twist of betrayal that had become my constant companion. Sophie and I would meet late at night, sometimes just to talk, sometimes for more, and the lines between revenge and something real blurred in a way that left me reeling. But each encounter served as a reminder of what I was fighting for. This was no longer just about Maya's affair. It was about regaining control, proving to myself that I hadn't lost everything. We continued meeting with Gavin, learning more about Derek's shady past with each encounter. The stories piled up, giving us insight into the kind of man he truly was. There was one story, in particular, that stuck with me. How he had conned an ex-girlfriend into funding a fraudulent business venture, draining her savings before vanishing once he'd gotten what he wanted. This was the man Maya was so smitten with, the man she had sacrificed everything for. Knowing this filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and soon enough, she would have to confront the reality of who he truly was. Sophie threw herself into her role as my partner in crime with a fervor that surprised me. She'd show up with coffee, run errands, and linger just enough for Maya to notice, stirring a little jealousy without crossing any lines that would make her confront me directly. The excitement of watching Maya squirm, seeing doubt creep into her expression. It was a small victory, a chance to flip the script in my favor, if only temporarily. As Gavin shared more about Derek's sordid past during our clandestine meetings, my plan began to take shape. Maya was going to face the truth, whether she was ready for it or not. It wouldn't be long before her fairy tale crumbled, and I would be right there to watch it all fall apart. It was only when I scrutinized our finances that everything started to click into place. Initially, it was just a nagging suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. Surely she wouldn't be reckless enough to spend money on this fling with Derek. But as I combed through our bank statements, receipts, and credit card bills, the reality hit me like a cold splash of water. She had been bankrolling their rendezvous, not just with dinners and hotel rooms, but with gifts and, unbelievably, business investments under his name. I discovered wire transfers to his account for projects he had undoubtedly sold her on. I was stunned that the woman I had married had fallen for his schemes. Determined to uncover the full extent of her betrayal, I kept digging. The more I unearthed, the worse it became. I printed out everything, receipts, statements, all the proof I would need to illustrate just how deeply she had plunged into this affair. This was more than a fling. She was emotionally and financially invested in him. I reflected on all those times she had lectured me about spending, the arguments over insignificant amounts of money, and here she was, siphoning our savings to support a loser like him. I gathered everything and took it to Sophie, the one who had morphed into both my confidant and co-conspirator. When we met at my place, we spread the evidence across the dining room table like it was a strategic map. "It's disgusting, isn't it?" I said, glancing at the documents. "How could she stoop this low?" Sophie shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "She's completely blinded, Ethan. But that doesn't mean she gets to walk away unscathed. This evidence could ruin her in court." And she was right. A week later, we sat across from a lawyer. A shrewd, no-nonsense type who listened intently as we recounted our story. The details of the affair, the financial betrayal, everything. He didn't even flinch. It was clear he'd seen cases like this before. He took his time reviewing the evidence and, when he finally looked me straight in the eye, he said, "With this, she won't get a single penny. This will obliterate her credibility." That was precisely the reassurance I needed. We began laying the groundwork for the divorce, ensuring she would walk away with nothing but the wreckage she had created. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted the truth to be known, especially among her family, the people who had trusted her and had no idea who she had become. So one evening, I arranged to meet her parents. Sitting in their living room, surrounded by their warmth and kindness, felt surreal. They had treated me well over the years, and I knew they didn't deserve the deceit Maya had woven around them. I didn't hold back. I laid out the facts, one after the other. The affair, the financial betrayal, the lies. I watched as their faces drained of color, the disbelief washing over her father's expression and the shock on her mother's face. They sat in stunned silence, absorbing the information. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, while her father's jaw clenched tighter with every word I uttered. I hated having to deliver this news, but they needed to know the reality. After that meeting, I noticed they stopped reaching out to her, ceased inviting her over. It became clear where their loyalties now lay. With all the evidence gathered, Sophie and I made one final stop. The hotel where Maya had met Derek countless times. We walked in together, pretending to be just another couple checking in, but we had a singular goal in mind: to obtain security footage. Sophie had managed to secure a contact at the hotel, a guy willing to look the other way for a bit of cash. A few hours later, we walked out with exactly what we needed: crystal clear shots of Maya and Derek together, laughing, holding hands, acting as if they had no worries in the world. This was the final nail in the coffin, the last piece of evidence to ensure her lies couldn't withstand the scrutiny of daylight. I could already picture the shock on her face when she realized just how much I knew, how thoroughly she had been exposed. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of power, ready to witness the collapse of her carefully constructed facade. As the court date approached, the tension between us was thick and suffocating. Maya tried to play it cool, acting as if everything was fine, that I was oblivious to her deceit, but there was a crack in her facade. I could see the fear lurking in her eyes every time I entered the room, a flicker of realization that told me she was starting to grasp the enormity of the mess she had created. The walls were closing in on her, and I could sense the weight of her actions pressing down on her shoulders. I was eagerly counting down the days until I could finally reveal everything in court. But before that moment arrived, I had one last card to play. I wanted her to understand exactly who she had chosen over me. Maya had been living in a fantasy, blind to the truth about Derek, but that was about to change. Sophie and I had gathered all the evidence we needed, proof of Derek's past scams, his endless trail of women, each one just as naive as the last. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing she was about to confront the reality of her betrayal, not just toward me, but toward herself. One night, as she sat across from me, I unleashed everything I had. I laid out Derek's sordid history, his cons, the way he had manipulated women for money, gifts, and a lifestyle he couldn't sustain on his own. Her face went pale as I spoke, the color draining as the realization hit her. I showed her all the evidence, the messages we had uncovered, the stories Gavin had shared, every filthy detail laid bare. She looked as if she might be sick, her hands trembling as she clutched the pages, her eyes darting around as if searching for a way to deny it all. "You thought he loved you?" I couldn't suppress the bitterness in my voice. "You really believed you were special? You were just another name on his list, Maya." Another bank account to drain. She sat there in shocked silence, too stunned to respond, her mouth opening and closing as she fought to find her voice. I studied her closely, waiting for some flicker of understanding, some sign that she grasped the enormity of what she'd done. Instead, she shook her head, clinging to denial like a lifeline. A few days later, she attempted to reach out to Derek, likely desperate for answers, trying to salvage any remnants of her twisted fantasy. Of course, he ignored her calls and texts, brushing aside every frantic attempt she made to contact him. She must have tried half a dozen times, each call going straight to voicemail, and with every rejection, I could see the panic growing in her eyes. Eventually, she managed to track him down at a cafe they used to frequent. I wasn't there, but I heard it didn't go well. She showed up, practically pleading for an explanation, for some reassurance that what they had shared was real. But Derek didn't hold back. He told her outright that she no longer interested him, not without the money. He made it clear she was just a pawn in his game, a means to an end, and now that she had nothing left to offer, he was done with her. I can only imagine the look on her face as he walked away, leaving her standing alone, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her own choices. She came home late that night, her face drained of color, her eyes vacant. She barely glanced at me as she walked past, retreating into the bedroom without uttering a word. I didn't need to ask what had transpired. I already knew. The truth had finally caught up with her. In the days that followed, she fell into an eerie silence I had never witnessed before. Hours slipped by as she sat there, staring blankly at the walls, at the spaces where our family photos used to hang. I had taken them down one by one, stripping her of any distractions, forcing her to confront the emptiness of the life she had created. She was utterly isolated, abandoned, with no one left to turn to. Her friends had distanced themselves, her family wanted nothing to do with her, and now even Derek had cast her aside like yesterday's news. She was truly alone, facing the consequences of her choices with no one to catch her as she fell. And as much as I had once loved her, as hard as I had tried to hold onto the life we'd built, I couldn't muster any sympathy for her. This was the end of her fairy tale with Derek, the final chapter of a story she had written herself. She had betrayed me, betrayed everything we once had, and now, as she sat in that empty house, I knew she was paying the price. Once the divorce was finalized, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt free from the lies, the betrayal, and the twisted mess that Maya had pulled me into. It was strange standing on the other side of it all, finally seeing my life clearly again. Throughout the entire process, Sophie had stood by my side, loyal and unwavering in a way I hadn't anticipated but had come to rely on. After everything we'd been through, it felt right to step into this new chapter together. We didn't hold back. After months of quiet revenge and secretive plans, I felt no need to tiptoe around anything anymore. Sophie and I began going out as a couple, attending events, mingling with friends, and enjoying life openly. People took notice. Naturally, they did. Whispers circulated. A low buzz about what happened to Ethan and Maya began to weave its way through social circles. Everyone sensed that something was amiss, but they didn't yet know the full story. They would catch snippets here and there, and as expected, the speculation escalated. Maya's betrayal became the talk of our social groups, an open secret everyone was eager to unravel. Surprisingly, Sophie and I found ourselves at the center of it all, and in a positive way. People began to see her as my true partner, the one who had supported me through thick and thin. It felt like a second chance, a fresh start with someone who genuinely valued me. I knew there was one final step left to take. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closing this chapter definitively, leaving no doubt about what had transpired and who was responsible. I organized a gathering, inviting friends, mutual acquaintances, and those who had been part of our lives before everything fell apart. I knew Maya would be there. It was the one place she wouldn't want to be, yet couldn't avoid. Deep down, she knew what awaited her. On the night of the gathering, an eerie calm enveloped me. The room buzzed with conversation, and Sophie stood by my side, a reassuring presence amid the sea of curious faces. When Maya arrived, her expression soured the instant she stepped through the door. Her eyes darted around, probably sensing she was walking into a trap. I could see her attempting to smile, trying to maintain her carefully constructed facade, but it was crumbling. The weight of everything she had done was pressing heavily upon her. Halfway through the evening, I took a deep breath and stood up, commanding silence as I raised my glass. "Thank you all for being here," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Some of you might have heard rumors, snippets of what's been happening over the past few months. Tonight, I want to share the truth." I paused, letting the silence thicken. Every eye in the room locked onto me. I began recounting my journey, from the moment I first suspected something was wrong to the ultimate betrayal involving Derek. I didn't hold back, allowing everyone to witness the raw, unfiltered truth of Maya's actions. To drive my point home, I revealed the evidence. The photos, the messages, the bank statements, all of it. Each revelation landed like a punch, and as I continued, I watched Maya's face lose all color, her mouth agape as the truth unfurled around her. People began shifting in their seats, expressions morphing from shock to disgust as the extent of her betrayal became apparent. She tried to form words, stammering in disbelief, but nothing came out. Overwhelmed, her usual charm evaporated under the weight of her lies. It was her ultimate humiliation, the moment she had to confront the reality of her choices with no escape. She sank into a chair, defeated, her head bowed as the murmurs in the room grew louder, the full impact of her actions laid bare for all to see. For the first time, it seemed she understood the consequences of her actions, the reality of the life she had carelessly thrown away. She could barely handle the shame, left to confront the wreckage of her life, a hollow shell of the person she had once pretended to be. After that night, everything felt lighter. I knew I had closed that chapter, leaving nothing to tether me to the past. I was finally free, untangled from the lies, the betrayal, and the resentment that had clouded my life for too long. Sophie and I moved forward together, ready to embrace our new life, leaving the past behind and focusing on the future. As I looked around the room at the friends who still stood by me, and at the woman who had supported me through my darkest moments, I realized I was finally free to live the life I deserved. This was the ending I needed, a clean slate, a fresh start, and a future unshackled from the complicated web of deceit that Maya had woven.